Pop's Grocery was the kind of place that sold bait in the morning and beer in the evening. A little bit of everything but a lot of nothing, all at a higher price than what the big supermarket chains could afford. The dusty two-lane road in front of Pop's hadn't seen much traffic since the highway had been built. Weeds grew in the cracks of its asphalt parking lot. The white-painted brick was peeling. The lights were dim, the shelves half empty. The place hurt to look at, especially since I could remember what it used to be like. I had grown up shopping there with my grandfather, and back then, Pop's Grocery was the heart of the community. When I moved back to my hometown, I wanted to save it, and I had a feeling that the data was on my side. Upscale suburbs and shipping warehouses were sprouting like mushrooms all around Pop's. The county's tax base and population were growing for a change. People were passing by the old store again. People with empty refrigerators and growling stomachs who might be willing to pay a little more to shop locally. Or so I hoped. The plan looked fine on paper, when the impossibly large quantities of money involved were all just imaginary. Real life, however, was a different story. My heart was in my throat as I walked into the manager's office to begin the negotiations. I could feel the employees watching me, knowing that everything was about to be in my hands. If I screwed this up, I wouldn't be the only one going bankrupt. The manager's office itself didn't exactly give the impression of modernity and success. Soggy greenish-gray carpet, mismatched furniture, stained ceiling tiles, and ugly yellow walls. I moved to close the door, but Steve Couch, the fourth-generation owner of the place, shook his head. "I'll leave it open." He reached into his desk and offered me an ancient cigar. I realized that as far as Steve was concerned, the negotiations were already over. Pop's Grocery was mine, and he was glad to see it go. I was honestly surprised. The numbers that he had shown me about the store's profits were bad, but they weren't that bad. Pop's had been in the Couch family for over 70 years, and I had expected Steve to put up more of a fight. Instead, he had told me about his plans to retire to Florida and said that his lawyer would be in touch. The amount of information that I had to take in during those first days was overwhelming. I misplaced documents, mixed up the names and faces of my new employees, and felt a deepening sense of dread as Steve Couch walked me through the store, cheerfully explaining all the work that needed to be done. I stayed late that first Friday night, wandering through Pop's Grocery after closing time at 8:30. I needed to clear my head, to remind myself why I was doing all of this in the first place. I ran my fingers along the polished chrome of the dairy section, admired the neon signs and checkered tiles. Alone in the old store after hours, I had the uncanny feeling that I was back in the past, like no time had passed at all. A loud crash jolted me out of my reminiscing. I felt the blood rush from my face, and I had locked the doors. Nobody else should have been in the store at this time. Was someone taking advantage of the chaotic transition, using it as an opportunity to steal from Pop's? They would have to be desperate or insane to rob a failing grocery store. Desperate, insane, maybe even violent. Just a few days ago, I had read an article about a meth addict who had crushed a man's skull during a mugging gone bad. I didn't think that my little hometown had a major drug problem. But then again, I had been away for a long time. "Hello," I called out. My voice echoed strangely in the empty space. Without the beeping checkout lanes and the background conversations, the silence in Pop's felt ominous, even menacing. I found myself looking nervously over my shoulder as I jogged toward the source of the noise, somewhere in the back of the cereal section. 2 minutes later, I paused, panting. The end of the aisle wasn't any closer. In fact, it was like I hadn't moved at all. I took a deep breath, trying to get myself under control. It wasn't impossible. I mean, physics didn't work like that. Yet when I ran all out toward the glowing neon sign above the deli section, it actually seemed to get further away. The lights flickered suddenly. It felt like a warning. Hadn't Steve Kelch said that the writing in Pops needed to be updated? That the power sometimes just went out? Panicking, I turned backward in the direction that I had come from. But I could no longer see the front of the store. It was lost in hazy darkness. I could feel myself beginning to hyperventilate. To get my breathing under control, I tried to center my attention on the products around me. At first, they looked just like the standard bakery items available in any supermarket. But only at first. Bread, spelled B-R-E-D, read the plastic wrap loaf in front of me. I almost laughed. It was a misprint, it had to be. The stuff inside was greenish black and lumpy. I was reaching out for it when it flopped off of the shelf and landed on the beige tile floor in front of me. It flailed wildly like the contents were trying to gnaw their way out. I backed away with a shudder. The products looked almost exactly like the ones I knew, but there was something wrong with all of them. I could feel it, and that wasn't all. Was it just me, or was something moving in the next aisle? I didn't call out any greeting this time. I didn't know what was going on, but I was certain of one thing. Someone or something in Pop's grocery wished me harm. A loud creak. A hideous metallic groan boomed through the store, so loud it felt like the walls themselves were being rearranged. I glanced up at the neon deli sign. It looked as far away as a distant star, but at least it gave me something to move toward, as quickly and quietly as I could. 10 minutes passed and then 20. All I could do was keep walking. That metallic groan was closer now and louder. I sprinted, careless of the dizzying way the aisle stretched out beneath my feet. Just when I thought that I couldn't run any further, the fluorescent lights overhead began to flicker out one by one. Darkness closed in on me like a wave. Instinct had taken over, the animal part of my brain pushing my aching legs beyond what they would ordinarily have been capable of. I nearly slipped on the oversized cereal box on the floor in front of me. I stared at it stupidly, suddenly remembering why I had gone down the aisle in the first place. Looking back over my shoulder, the lights were back on and I could hear footsteps. "Can I get that for you, honey?" A scream rose in my throat when I heard the woman's husky voice, but it was just Irene, the longest-serving employee of Pop's grocery. The original Pop had hired her when she was a teenager, and according to local gossip, she had also raised 3 of his illegitimate children. Their names, Debbie, Snyder, and Oscar, were allegedly based on the product boxes atop which they had been conceived. I suppose the kids were lucky that none of them had ended up with Kit Kat or Ho-Ho. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, with all the authority of a limp noodle. "Well, somebody locked the front door while I was having a smoke." Irene grinned. "So I had to come around back." I checked my watch. I had been running down that horrible aisle for what felt like hours. How could it be that just 5 minutes had passed? Irene's watchful green eyes took in the sweat on my forehead and my pale, frightened face. She chose her next words carefully. It's not a good idea to be all alone in a big store like this. You never know what might happen. You okay? I nodded, but I practically clung to Irene's apron strings as she finished looking up and headed into the foggy parking lot for one last cigarette. I remember you, you know, she said suddenly when we had reached our cars. You used to come in here with your grandpa. He would buy fish bait, diet soda, and a cheese and egg sandwich every Saturday morning like clockwork. He used to push you around in a shopping cart. She exhaled a cloud of smoke and looked back at the dark hulk of Pop's grocery. You really think you can turn this place around? I hope so, I answered honestly. Yeah, me too. I got grandkids to feed, and God knows my deadbeat daughters aren't going to get them jobs themselves. Irene hopped into her driver's seat with the agility of somebody half her age. I swallowed nervously and bent down beside her driver's side window. Look, I began. None of the books that I've read on management had a chapter on how to thank an employee who just saved your life. It probably isn't a good idea to hang around the parking lot for too long either, Irene said pointedly, and then revved her engine and winked. With a smile, I slid behind the wheel of my own car and followed her taillights into the darkness. I began remodeling Pop's grocery the very next day. Maybe it was foolish to hope that whatever haunted the store that I had bought could be exorcised by a few coats of fresh paint, but I had to start somewhere. Besides, in the back of my mind, I still secretly hoped that there might be a logical explanation for what I had experienced. My wife theorized that what had happened to me was a hallucination caused by stress, and there was definitely enough of that to go around. Steve Couch had claimed that nothing in Pop's grocery had been updated since Reagan was president, and he hadn't been exaggerating. The first thing that I wanted to replace were the ancient fluorescent lights, which, as I had already experienced, would flicker and go out unexpectedly. The PA system was a close second. I had already had 2 electricians come and take a look at it, but neither could explain the unnerving metallic groans that sometimes emanated from the speakers, or the way they seemed to pick up other frequencies, like the screaming man. Russell Hughes, 315-4517. The frantic voice would boom, warbled and chopped with static. This is Russell Hughes, 315-4517. If anybody can hear this, send help. Russell Hugh. Sooner or later, the man's plea disappeared, swallowed up by the shopping music. At first, I thought it was just the staff playing a strange prank. The third time it happened, I called a meeting in the break room and told these 7 employees on duty that we needed to talk about the noises coming from the PA system. When I did, every face went pale. Erica Hawkins, a skinny red-headed teenager who had only been at Pop's grocery for 2 months, immediately raised her hand to speak. Erica said that she had been opening the store one morning when she had heard a female voice humming softly from the speaker above her. Erica recognized the tune. It was a song her mother, Tanya, had hummed to her when she was a baby, and Tanya Hawkins had been dead for years. Unnerved, Erica had hurried to the other side of the store, but the humming followed. It went from speaker to speaker, getting louder and more aggressive until Erica was curled up beside the ice chest, with her hands pressed over her ears, sobbing. When her coworkers shook her and asked what was wrong, none of them could hear a thing. Seconds later, the humming ended as mysteriously as it had begun. Erica had taken her 15-minute break, chugged an iced frappuccino, and went back to work as though nothing had happened. When Erica finished her story, the break room was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I looked nervously from face to face. "Has anybody else experienced anything unusual while working here?" I asked. "Hey, it's okay, just raise your hand." All 7 employees looked at one another, and then lifted their hands slowly into the air. I blinked. "Well, I just want you all to know that I'm going to look into it." No response. Irene coughed. "Are we done here? I could use a smoke." I broke up the meeting and hurried back to the manager's office. Like the break room, it was an insult to interior designers everywhere. Gray and green carpet, hideous yellow walls, and 3 generations of chipped fake wood furniture. I tried to place a call to the previous owner, but Steve Kelch wasn't available for comment. Apparently, he had followed through with his plan to sell everything and move off to Florida, without leaving any forwarding address. Steve Kelch's voicemail wasn't set up either. As I listened to the dial tone, I drummed my fingers irritably against the desk and noticed something odd. The manager's desk almost sounded hollow. I ran my thumb along the edge until I felt a click. A latch released and the top of the desk lifted upward, revealing a pile of yellowed papers. Most of them were business documents, but at the bottom of the pile I found a handwritten list going back all the way to when Pop's Grocery first had opened up in the 60s. It was a list of names and dates. There was Frank Kelch, the first owner of Pop's, who had died of a heart attack while opening the store. There was Russell Hughes, the mysterious voice in the PA system. And then I saw a third name that made my blood run cold. Edgar Lee, my grandfather. I had been told that he had gone missing while on a fishing trip in 2005. So what was his name doing on a weird list hidden in the manager's office at Pop's Grocery? And he wasn't the only one who had run into bad luck either. A quick online search revealed that every one of the 11 individuals on the list were either missing or dead. A chill ran through me. Just what kind of list was I looking at here? Suddenly, I heard a creaking sound overhead. The ceiling tiles above me had warped and bent, like something heavy was crawling right above me. I looked up and realized that the door to the manager's office had shut, even though I couldn't remember closing it myself. I felt a chill as I remembered Irene's warning. It's not a good idea to be all alone in a big store like this. You never know what might happen. Something that might have been drool dribbled onto my shoulder from the black gap between these sagging tiles. I grabbed the strange list, sprang out of my chair, and bolted for the door. Dust rained down as the thing in the ceiling gave chase. I burst out of my office and into my office again. The ugly yellow paint and fake wood furniture were identical to the room that I had just left. Only this time, there were 4 doors instead of 1. I couldn't help but wonder where they led, and what might be waiting for me on the other side. A sudden slam knocked my hand off of the doorknob. The wood behind me splintered. Something was trying to knock down the door. I went into the room on the left, and I wasn't surprised that it was yet another version of my office again. No matter how many doors I opened, the result was always the same. 12 rooms later, the noises behind me had gone quiet. I pressed my ear against the cool wood of the door. Maybe whatever was chasing me had given up. Or was it just sneaking up on me from a different direction? I could see it as clearly as one of my childhood night terrors. The door across from me would creak open theatrically, revealing only blackness. A grinning, red-eyed thing would walk out of those shadows. It would take its time enjoying this, knowing that I had nowhere to run. It would pull me apart and devour me right there on the pea-green carpet. And that would be the last that anybody would hear of the out-of-towner who tried to save Pop's grocery. The room spun. I leaned back against the wall trying to get control of myself, and I felt something odd. Someone had strung a fishing line along it. The wire led to the door on the left and continued on the other side. I followed it left and then right again. As I did, I noticed how large, sinister X's had been carved into several doors. Even more disturbingly, a few had been barricaded shut with furniture. I kept following the fishing wire. It occurred to me that it might be a trap, but what choice did I have? Continue wandering through those hideous offices until I died of dehydration, or the thing in the ceiling finally caught up to me. Finally, I staggered into a room whose walls were splattered with gore. The fishing line dragged loosely along the floor, as though whoever had been placing it had been injured, perhaps fatally. Their bloody trail through the middle door. The corpse in the next room was so fresh that the man could have been killed only seconds ago, but his outfit was from another era. He wore bell-bottom jeans, a striped shirt with a wide open collar, and a shag hairdo that was sticky with blood. His eyes, ears, nose, and tongue were all missing. The fishing wire that I had been following through those nightmarish rooms ended in his right hand, and his left arm was reaching toward the door across the room. I had just stooped down to inspect the body when I heard a familiar creaking in the ceiling. I didn't think twice. I fled through the door that the dead man was pointing to, and I found myself back in the version of the manager's office that I recognized. Here, the only door was the one that I had just walked through, and when I opened it for a second time, I was back in Pop's grocery. The corpse and infinite rooms were gone, but that weird list was still in my hand. I asked Irene to cover for me and I headed for the sheriff's office. I was lucky that Sheriff Benjamin Lloyd was in his office and not in a squad car waiting to pull me over. I was so disturbed by what I had seen that I made the 20-minute drive across town in less than 10. The office was quiet, and Sheriff Lloyd called me into his office right away. "Yeah, I recognize some of these names," he grunted, twirling his mustache as he read through the list that I had presented to him. He seemed nervous, but I wasn't sure why. Linda Newsom, for instance. She tried to chew the postman's face off back in '07. What? She tried to eat someone? Yep, happened in your store too. The sheriff eyed me suspiciously, as though this was somehow my fault. She came running out of the automotive section and started biting this poor fella. When we were able to finally drag her off of him, she was screaming about how she had been lost in the store for weeks and how she was so hungry. I shivered. Linda's story sounded too familiar for comfort. "Do you have any idea why my grandfather's name would be on this list? He went missing in a fishing accident." "Well, I mean, that's what we figured. We found his truck in the store lot. Plenty of people parked there and dragged their canoes to the creek across the road." "The store lot? You mean Pop's?" I couldn't believe it. "Of course. Back then, Pop's was the only store there was." "So let me get this straight." I took a deep breath. You've got a bunch of disappearances and murders and weird events that all happen in the same place, and no one has done anything about it." Sheriff Lloyd reclined in his chair with a mean glint in his eye, like he was sizing me up for an orange jumpsuit. "I'm not sure I like what you're implying here, son. We're talking about very different crimes. Look, if you take a 60-year history of any place, you're bound to find some unexplained deaths and odd happenings. It's around us all the time. We just don't pay any attention to it." The sheriff got to his feet and opened his office door. "I'm sorry I couldn't be of more help, but I need to get back to work." "So there won't be an investigation?" I demanded. "There already was an investigation," Lloyd sneered. "Back when I was a deputy, my predecessor, Sheriff Paulson, led it personally." "Your predecessor? Could I speak with him then?" "Sure you can if you can find him." Lloyd handed the list back to me, his finger hovering over the final name. James Paulson. I drew some strange looks from the customers as I skidded into the reserved for manager parking spot at Pop's Grocery, leapt from the car like a drunk and ran straight for Irene. I found her beside one of the new automated cash registers that I had installed. The machine had swallowed a customer's money and was making a hellish whirring sound until Irene had smacked it expertly. The machine made a sad robotic beep and spat out a 20. Satisfied, she turned to me. "You knew," I snapped, careless of the people around. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Well, I used to tell lots of people about what goes on around here, and then some of them disappeared, and I stopped talking so much." She eyed me coolly. "The more you notice this place, the more it notices you." I looked helplessly around at the freshly painted aisles, the bright shelves brimming with the new organic produce that I had ordered, the employees chatting while on break. This place had been my dream, my investment, my hope for the future. What would I do if it failed? I had no idea. I hung my head. "You want my advice?" Irene clapped me on the shoulder. "Forget about it. Stay where it's bright and crowded, ignore anything unusual, and get paid at the end of the month and get on with your life. That's what I do, and 40 years later I'm still here." "But what about my grandfather? What about Frank Kelch, Sheriff Paulson, and who knows how many others?" "What about them?" Irene sighed. "Look, I like you, kid. You've done a lot of good for this place, and I would hate to see you throw it all away the way those three did." I nodded, but inside I was reeling. "Those three," Irene had said. Was my grandfather investigating Pop's Grocery when he had disappeared, like the others were? Grandpa Eddie Lee had been a tough man, an ex-factory machinist whose thoughts didn't go much deeper than the trivia on the bottom of a beer coaster, or so I had always thought. After work, I stayed up past midnight going through my grandfather's old things. I found something that I never would have imagined in a hollowed-out Louis L'Amour novel. My grandfather had kept a diary. It chronicled Frank Kelch's discovery of the nightmare inside his store, Sheriff Paulson's investigation, and the three men's attempts to explore the strangeness that they had uncovered. It was full of sketches, expedition-style supply lists, handmade maps, and detailed directions for navigating the surreal labyrinth on the other side of Pop's Grocery. The last entry had been made just 2 days before my grandfather had disappeared, and I decided to start there. I knew that there was no way I could sleep after what I had read, and besides, according to my grandfather's diary, the hungry place inside of Pop's was most active at night. I loaded up a backpack with everything the diary suggested: spare water and food, light sources, warm clothing, fishing wire, and I headed back to Pop's. I felt a little silly walking around a grocery store with enough gear for a caving expedition, but soon enough I was glad that I had it. The changes began just as they had before, with the unsettling sensation that the aisle I was walking down had gotten just a bit longer than I remembered. I tied the first roll of fishing wire to the end cap, and when I turned, I experienced that stomach-churning sensation for the second time. The checkered tile floor was stretching out in front of me, extending like a cartoon carpet. The roll of fishing wire whirred and then finally came to a halt. I looked forward and then backward. There was no end to the aisle in which I stood. I hitched the backpack a little higher, hoping that the rattle of the food and water inside would calm my nerves, but it had the opposite effect. My supplies were limited, but the hungry place apparently wasn't. Did it even have an end? And by the time I found it, would I come out raving mad and hungry for anything, even human flesh? I had been worried that there would be monsters in this hellish other side of Pop's supermarket, but as I trudged down the infinite aisle, I realized that I had been mistaken. I had brought the monsters in with me. I clung to the fishing wire like a child clinging to a magical rabbit's foot, repeating to myself again and again that as long as I held it, I was safe. The further that I walked, however, the more I began to have my doubts. The new lamps that I had installed were retreating upwards and away, like stars expanding into an empty, lightless universe. Before long, they were just pinpricks in the dark, and then, not even that, I turned on my headlamp and realized that I could see my breath. I chanced to look at the products on the shelves beside me. At first, they appeared to have been altered in the same way as before. The labels misspelled, the products inside charcoal gray and strange. Now, however, they were hard to look at, bent, rotten, and wrong. Whatever change was affecting them, it was stronger in the dark. They reached out for me as I passed, as though attracted by the warmth of my blood. The black spots covering them might have been mold, or maybe clusters of eyes. I forced myself to look at the tile floor and keep walking, and walking and walking. The first roll of 3,000-meter fishing wire ran out, so did the second. While I was attaching the third to an aisle end cap, the thing on the shelf above me began to move. They were no longer simply squirming and squelching. They were actively trying to attack me. Black writhing shapes wrapped in plastic and cardboard launched themselves off the shelves to splatter on the checkered tile floor. I could hear slithering in the dark. The splattering became as loud as a heavy rainfall. There were thousands of them. I lost it. I started running. The backpack hammered against my back. Sweat poured down my forehead, but the sound was fading out. Whatever was back there, I had left it behind for now. Something new was ahead of me, a wall of glass-doored refrigerators. I focused the beam of my headlamp left and then right. There was no end to them in either direction, apart from a metal door that I recognized. It led to Pop's, a cold storage area. I took a step and then I felt a tug. Another roll of fishing wire had run out. My throat was dry. I had an insane urge to shout, "Anyone home?" into the abyss just to break the awful silence of the place. But I knew that making a sound here would be death. I couldn't see what was on the other side of the clouded, freezer-burnt refrigerator doors, and I was pretty sure that I didn't want to. Holding my breath, I tied my second-to-last roll of fishing wire to the handle of the metal door and I stepped inside. There could be no doubt about it. I was in another world now. As far as I knew, I had gone deeper into this bizarre other world that existed inside of Pop's grocery than anybody had before. I had discovered an end to these supposedly endless aisles, a wall of freezer-burned refrigerators with 2 rusted double doors in the middle, doors which in my reality led to the cold storage area. As I stepped through them, some instinct screamed that I was making a mistake, that it was my last chance to turn back. I ignored it. I had come this far, and who could say if I would ever be back here again? When I didn't hear any doors close behind me, I knew that something was wrong. The employees at Pop's were constantly complaining about how the doors swung shut with a vengeance, always smashing the foot or shoulder of whoever was pushing a pallet through to the other side. But the moment that I stepped through, it was like the whole place that I had left behind had ceased to exist. The doors, the refrigerators, the endless aisles, they were all gone. The fishing wire went limp in my hands. A bare concrete floor stretched on as far as the light of my headlamp could reach. The space was dark and freezing. My employees and I usually put on an extra layer when we worked in cold storage, but the temperatures here were so low that my teeth were chattering. I put on the heavier clothes that I had brought in my backpack. My grandfather had been right on the expedition. Quality gear was needed while exploring, wherever this was. I started walking forward, or at least in the direction that I thought was forward. The emptiness of the space was starting to get to me. The cold was too. I just needed to see some kind of landmark, some sign that the darkness that I was trapped in didn't just go on forever. I almost fell down the stairs. They were the same ugly gray color as the concrete floor, almost like they had been made to blend in on purpose. By who or what, I couldn't imagine, but this was a first. There were no stairs in the cold storage area of Pop's, and none had been mentioned in my grandfather's journal either. Was this where it all ended? Had Frank Couch, Sheriff Paulson, and my grandfather all reached this point, to never come back from what lay beyond it? There was only one way that I could find out. I pulled my knit cap a little tighter over my ears and I started down the stairs. The air got colder and hazier the further that I went, filled with tiny floating particles like dust. I was just beginning to wonder what they were and whether breathing them in might be dangerous, when a white-hot burst of pain exploded in my skin. I tumbled forward, crashing into a wall that signaled the end of the stairs. My blood turned to ice when I realized what I had tripped over. It was another fishing wire. Somebody had been here before. I got to my feet, brushing clouds of blackish-gray dust from my clothing. To the right was an eerily ordinary door that read "Manager." It probably led back to the maze of offices that I knew so well. Wary of awakening whatever was on the other side, I looked left, where the fishing wire led down a tangled corridor of cords, tubes, and rusted pipes. Each time the corridor branched in a new direction, I followed the fishing wire. I knew that it was foolish to believe that whoever had placed the wire knew the way out of here, but it was the only hope that I had. Frayed electrical wires hung down like cobwebs from the low ceiling. Pipes jutted out into the narrow passage like vines in some bizarre industrial jungle. Just as I was stepping over one, I heard an uncannily familiar sound up ahead, a roll of fishing wire unraveling. I rushed around the corner up ahead, eager to meet whoever was exploring this place with me. I should have known. I got lucky. The shotgun blast deafened me, but missed taking off my face by just a few inches. Shrapnel from the wall sliced into my cheeks as I instinctively hit the floor, hands over my head. "Don't shoot!" I screamed at the short, stocky figure standing at the far end of the hallway. He had a yellowed miner's flashlight taped to his shotgun and wore gear that looked like Korean war kit from some army surplus store. I rolled backwards as he fired a second time. "Liar," a hoarse voice roared. "You won't fool me, you beast. Die." More deafening shots blasted the wall. A few of the pipes began leaking a murky reddish liquid that steamed as it oozed out of them. But I had bigger problems. The crazed explorer was charging me. All I could do was run, following the most convoluted path, in the hopes that my pursuer wouldn't be able to get a clear shot. As I sprinted away from the deranged, howling voice behind me, the corridors became stranger. The walls and floor were no longer entirely concrete and wire. Parts of them were uncomfortably spongy and warm to the touch. The branching pipes took on organic shapes that reminded me uncomfortably of human veins. "Liar, face stealer, what did you do with Eddie?" "Eddie? Edgar Lee, my grandfather." Another shot hit the wall in front of me. This time, an awful moan reverberated through the corridor. I couldn't shake the feeling that this part of Pops was alive somehow, and that we were making it angry. The ragged wires hanging from the ceiling now seemed more like hair. The floor became uneven and bone-like. I had to act. Crouching behind a sharp corner, I took off my backpack. When my pursuer came charging past, I swung it into his face as hard as I could. The big man went down, but he kept his grip on the shotgun. I coiled myself around it, fighting to pry it from his grasp as he fired twice more into the ceiling of the corridor. By the time that I wrangled it away from him, it was out of ammunition, and more of that murky red goo was dripping from the ceiling above him. I looked down at the now empty shotgun. Paulson read the name engraved into the stock. "I'm not a monster," I shouted. "I'm Edgar Lee's grandson." That's impossible. It seemed to take Sheriff Paulson a moment to realize how absurd it was to think that anything was impossible in a place like this. "It got to Eddie. He's a part of it now. My God, how long have I been in here?" Sheriff Paulson looked to be in his early 60s. Probably the age that he was when he, Frank Couch, and my grandfather began exploring the place. But I wasn't concerned about that then. I was more worried about the ragged mass of black tendrils hanging down from the ceiling above Paulson, from the hole that he had created by firing so wildly with the shotgun. I had thought that it was my imagination at first, but those wires or hairs or whatever they were had begun to stretch downward toward the heavy-set old man on the floor. Before I could shout a warning, they had coiled around him, lifting him toward the black fissure in the ceiling. "You won't take me, no, you won't take me." He flailed his arms wildly, but it was too late. The ragged, reddish stuff that the ceiling was made of chomped down on Paulson again and again until nothing was left of him, apart from a single blood-splattered boot, which tumbled to the ground at my feet. The tendrils were inching toward me now, and I had no intention of being consumed as Paulson had. I sprinted forward, flinging even deeper into the maze of tunnels. I came here looking for answers about what had happened to my grandfather, but now that I had begun to find them, was I really sure that I wanted to know? Maybe I should have been paying more attention to what I had ahead of me, instead of the nightmare that I had left behind. I couldn't stop thinking about Sheriff Paulson, how he looked as though he had only disappeared a few days ago, even though almost 30 years had passed since he had gone missing. I couldn't stop thinking about the vein-like tendrils that had emerged from the wall to consume him. I couldn't stop thinking about this place, or part of it. Anyway, it was somehow alive. The sweat streamed down my forehead, my shirt was already soaked. The air had gotten warmer, thicker somehow, and it felt like no matter how heavily I breathed, it just wasn't enough. It was impossible to tell whether the pipes and wires that I was dodging were organic or mechanical, but it was clear that pretty soon the path would be too tangled to move forward. I glanced left and right, but the other passages looked even narrower. I took another deep breath that felt far too shallow. It was time to consider turning back. As I turned around, however, I realized that going back was no longer an option. The gruesome tubes that lined the walls were rearranging themselves, creating a flesh-colored web to block my path. I had a knife to hack through them with in my pack, which I had lost in the fight with Sheriff Paulson and his shotgun. I stopped moving and I forced myself to think. When I had come across the staircase a few hours before, all of my thoughts had been focused on finding some kind of structure that led to somewhere else. Likewise, Sheriff Paulson had clearly felt trapped and threatened by his surroundings. Could it be that the place was feeding off my fear, my claustrophobia? If I could concentrate my thoughts on something else. An image flashed through my head. My grandfather holding my hand while we walked through the aisles of pubs. We had just been fishing on a humid summer morning and I was starving. And Grandpa Eddie was telling me that we could split a carton of ice cream that I wanted, so long as I didn't tell Mom. I fixated on that memory as I moved forward, recoiling at the touch of the sticky touch of these strands that blocked my path. It wasn't enough. Maybe I just couldn't keep my mind off of the slowly constricting tunnel around me. Maybe I had been wrong all along and my fears and fantasies played no role at all in shaping the impossible space around me. Once it swallowed me up, just like it had swallowed Sheriff Paulson and Grandpa Eddie, and who knew how many others. None of it would matter anyway. The strands were too thick to push through now, and with every passing second, the tunnel became just a tiny bit tighter. It was going to crush me to death. I shut my eyes and accepted my fate. If I was going to die, at least I wanted to do it with a beautiful thought in mind. A summer day fishing with Grandpa Eddie, ice cream, any flavor that I wanted. I gave one final push and the wall gave way. As constricting as it was, it had only been a thin membrane, one which resealed itself the moment that I was through. I was back in the freezer aisle. Something squirmed in the distance where before the endless rows of refrigerators had disappeared into darkness. There was a wall there right now, but it was moving. I tensed up, ready for anything, except for what appeared. An eye opened in the wall. It was grotesquely large, over 5 times my own size, yet I recognized it. It was my grandfather's. It watched me for a long moment, its expression unreadable, and then vanished. I was too stunned to move until I realized what the appearance of the wall meant. There might be an end to this place after all. If I could focus all my thoughts on the store, not on escape, not on terror, just on walking through its aisles one more time. Beeping. I had spent so long on the other side that at first I didn't recognize the sound of the automatic checkout. An old woman in the dairy section dropped the block of cheese that she was holding as I passed, and she wasn't the only one who was staring. I realized how I must look. Filthy, bruised, and bleeding, with a 2-day growth of beard on my face and terror in my eyes. I could hear casual conversations and music playing softly from the speakers. The products on the shelves, the overhead lights, the length of the aisles. They were all normal, safe. Or so I thought. Was there really any way to know whether I had actually returned to where I had come from? or whether I was just lost in yet another pocket dimension inside of Pop's grocery. I didn't have an answer then, and I still don't. All I can do is stick to the plan and try to live my life as best as I can. After I cleaned myself up in the bathroom, I went to the manager's office and wrote a brief speech, with the door open, of course. In it, I outlined the importance of not being alone in Pop's grocery, of leaving doors open, of staying focused on reality when fear began to change it. All of the lessons I had learned during my 3 nearly fatal explorations. The younger employees rolled their eyes when I announced the new store policies, but Irene nodded approvingly. The subtle warnings she had tried to give her coworkers over the years were finally being made official. I hoped it would be enough. Until now, those instructions to my employees were the closest that I came to telling anyone about what I underwent on the other side of Pop's grocery. I'm still not sure whether telling my story is the right thing to do. I can't shake the feeling that the forces present in places like Pop's are sentient somehow. Maybe it wants the store to be successful, to increase its chances of catching prey. Maybe it let me go knowing that I would share my experience, potentially luring in other foolish explorers. Well, that's a chance that I'll have to take. I need the world to know that the hungry places exist. I need people to be aware that there are worlds hidden beneath the surface of this one, worlds that thrive on fear and pain. And that if you're not careful, you can get lost in them forever.